This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Now when Jesus heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he was with a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured the sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the gospel of the Lord, and you may be seated. I want to begin just by offering my thanks to the Clarion Quartet. You guys are an amazing group. I absolutely love the clarinet. It's one of my favorite musical instruments. Many years ago, I got to see the Minnesota Orchestra, hear the Minnesota Orchestra play Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, and that begins with that amazing clarinet piece. I'm not a musical person, so I don't know what that's called, but it goes way up, high up, and kind of goes down, and just an amazing piece. So if I had to do elementary school all over again, I would play the clarinet. I played the trumpet very badly, and my band director told me I had turkey lips and said I wasn't very good at the trumpet. But I think I would have gotten the clarinet. It's a wonderful instrument. So once again, thanks for sharing your ministry with us on this day. Just wonderful, just absolutely wonderful. Well, today for my sermon, I want to talk about how God makes the impossible possible. So if you're out and about and somebody says, "What was the sermon about today?" Then you can just say, well, it was something about God makes the impossible possible. That can be an easy way to remember what this sermon is all about. So I want to begin my sermon by sharing a story with you about how the impossible was made possible. And it's about one of our church members here, and I got his permission, and I warned his wife at the beginning of the service that I'd be talking about him. His name is Bert Borgen. Many of you know who Bert Borgen is. He is just an incredible guy. And I called him this week and I said, "Bert, I'm preaching a sermon about the impossible things that God makes possible. I'm talking about miracles. I need to tell your story. Is that okay, Bert?" You have the right to refuse, though. "Oh, that would be fine. Everybody knows about it anyway, so you might as well share the story." So I got a call a week ago Saturday from Elaine, and she had shared that Bert was in an accident. It was a voicemail, and said that he had been run over by a tractor. And I didn't tell you this, but I listened to that message twice because I thought I heard you say he was run over by a tractor. I couldn't believe my ears. So then I immediately called her back, and she assured me that he was fine, that he was in the hospital, and then she told me the story of what had happened. Well, he was at his farm just north of Moorhead, 30-some miles, somewhere in that vicinity. He goes up there quite a lot, and I've been able to visit up there a couple of times, which has been great. So he was up there, and he was working on a tractor, getting a tractor moved, and somehow it went into gear, and he fell, and the rear tractor tire ran over him, and he even had the tractor tire markings to prove it on his body, on his belly. And she's telling me this story, and I thought, well, certainly the ambulance must have come directly to the farm, and they took him to the hospital. Well, he shut the tractor down, he got up. Now, this is one tough guy. got up, shut the tractor down, and took his golf cart to his car, and he drove home back to Elaine. And he tells Elaine what went on, and she had said, well, we need to call the ambulance right away. So they called the ambulance and came and got him. And the ambulance drivers, the paramedics, were surprised too at what had happened. And then they drove him to the hospital, and lo and behold, he had some bumps and bruises, to be sure, some cracks here and there, but no internal bleeding, no broken ribs or broken bones. Was able to walk after this happened. Did I mention he got ran over by a tractor? It is remarkable. And I teased him and I said, well, your problem was it was an Alice Chalmers tractor, and it wasn't one of those John Deeres. He thought that was kind of funny. So a remarkable story, to be sure. And they got him to the hospital, checked him out, and then he went back home a couple of days later. And I just talked to Elaine today. He's still recuperating. He's still recovering. It is an absolute miracle. And then I got to visit him in the hospital at the new Sanford Hospital a week ago Sunday. And I got to see his bright, shining face, and he was the same old Bert, other than a few bumps and bruises along the way. And it was incredible. And Bert told me the whole story, and in my head I thought maybe he fell into sort of a little groove outside, and maybe that's, kind of softened the impact a little bit. But no, he was on a shop floor, a concrete floor, when all of this happened. And he's telling me this whole story, and I'm not really paying attention, because in my head I'm trying to wrap around my head how this happened, how he was able to survive all of this. Finally, then, I just gave up trying to figure it out, and I just received it as an absolute miracle. If you want to know what a miracle looks like, take a look at Bert. There's no doubt about it. The only thing I can figure out is there must have been a fleet of guardian angels that lifted that Alice Chalmers tractor up over him, so it wasn't such a blow to his body. It was a remarkable thing. The impossible was made possible. And I'm so grateful that he is doing as well as he is. Well, today's gospel is about another miracle. It's about God making the impossible possible. And it's about the feeding of the 5,000. It's a story that most of us are probably pretty familiar with. This is one of those stories that we hear early on in our education, our Christian education, a very famous story. And in this story, Jesus at the beginning wants to go off by himself because his cousin, John the Baptist, has been beheaded. He's been put to death. And Jesus is no doubt grieving deeply. And so Jesus is really good at taking care of himself. Whenever he goes through a difficult time, he always kind of takes time to be by himself, to take the time that he needs. He's a great model for us in how to take care of ourselves through this life that we live. So he goes away in a boat to this deserted place, and he walks up on shore. And as he walks up on shore, there's this huge crowd that comes because they know where he is. This was all before Facebook and social media. People knew, even without that sort of thing, people knew where Jesus was at all times, it seems. So there's this great crowd that gathers around Jesus. And I think the first miracle in this gospel is that Jesus doesn't get really, really mad and upset with this crowd. Here, Jesus wants to spend time by himself in prayer, and there's this crowd that shows up. I would have been mad. I've been like, get away. I need to just take some time for myself. But Jesus doesn't do that. The gospel says that he had compassion. He had compassion for the people, and he helped to heal their sick as well. That is the first miracle in this story. So then they're all hanging out on this deserted plain of sorts, and the hour is getting late. And then the disciples say to Jesus that we should probably dismiss these people so they can go back into the town to get food because they're probably getting really, really hungry. And then Jesus says this. He says, they need not go away. you give them something to eat. Now the disciples at this point must have been dumbfounded. Put yourself into the story. How would you have responded to Jesus at this moment? I think I would have been, yeah, right, we can't do that. That's impossible. That's impossible to be able to feed this great crowd of people. And then Jesus says, well, what do we have? And they replied, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And at this point, I would have really said, this is impossible. There's no way that we can feed this crowd of 5,000 men plus the women and children. There actually would have been maybe something like 10,000 people there. They just counted the 5,000 men. There were also women and children present as well. There was a lot of people. And they were going to feed all of these people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Impossible. Well, Jesus says, no, this is possible. And so he takes the loaves and the fish, and he blesses them, and then he gives them to the disciples to distribute to the crowds. And at this point, if I was one of those disciples, I would have taken the loaves and the fish, and I would have been passing it out saying, this is never going to work. This is never going to work. This is never going to work. I would have doubted. I don't know about all of you, but there's no way that 5 loaves and 2 fish are going to feed 5,000 plus people. So they distribute all of the food, and then the gospel says, all ate and were filled. All ate and were filled. People just didn't get a little morsel of food. People got as much as they wanted. All ate and were filled. Now, back in the day, eating till you were just incredibly full, that really wouldn't have been possible. People just ate enough to get by. So this whole idea of eating and being completely filled would have been a really big deal. And sometimes we miss that piece in this gospel. All ate and were completely filled and satiated. They got to eat as much as they wanted. And even with that, they picked up all of the leftovers, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers. Kind of interesting, one for each disciple, right? If you doubted before, you could look at the evidence that God takes the impossible and makes it possible. There were 12 baskets of leftovers. Absolutely incredible. And all ate and were filled. God takes the impossible and makes it possible. So then what can we learn from the parable of Bert and his tractor and this story, the feeding of the 5,000? Well, the first thing that I think that we can learn from these stories is something that I've already mentioned. With God, all things are possible. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. In our lives, we face things in life that seem seemingly impossible. But with God, when we give those impossible things to God, God can take those impossible things and make them possible. And you know, sometimes life can feel like a tractor has just run over us. And we all have reasons for why we feel that way sometimes. And it can be very easy to doubt during those dark tractor running over us times. But we can learn from this text that nothing that we face in life is too big for God. Nothing that we face in life is too big for God. Even when we feel like we have been run over by a tractor as big as a John Deere quad track, 9620 RX with the QSX 15, 14.9 liter Cummins diesel that produces a little over 600 horsepower, also featuring an E18 power shift transmission with command view 3 cab and a hydro cushion suspension. Believe me, that is a really, really big tractor. Even when we feel like we've been run over by a tractor that big, God is there to bring healing and new life. God makes the impossible possible. Nothing is too big for God. And if you ever doubt, and we all doubt, that God can't make the impossible possible, take a look at the cross. The cross is a persistent reminder in our lives that God can take the impossible and make things possible. The cross used to be a symbol of death. People were put to death on the cross. And then God sent God's Son into the world to die for our sins on that cross, and then was raised to new life on the third day. Talk about the impossible being made possible. And because Jesus was raised from the dead on the third day, we too will experience that new life of being with God in heaven. So when you doubt, look at the cross. Look at the cross. The second thing that we can learn from Bert and his tractor and this text is God is always at work in our life. And seeing those big miracles like someone being okay after getting run over by a tractor or the feeding of the 5,000 helps us to be aware of the little miracles in life. So pay attention to the little miracles in life that are actually really big miracles. The fact that we humans are even here on this planet walking around is an absolute miracle. All of the things, the thousands of things that have to happen in our bodies to make us move, to talk, and to communicate is an absolute miracle. I read recently that we have 100,000 miles of blood vessels in our bodies. 100,000 miles. And in this same article, they included also another depressing thing. They said if you gain a pound of weight, your body has to add 7 miles of blood vessels to accommodate that pound of weight. I thought that was kind of interesting. I've gained about 3 or 4 pounds eating all of this good food at family reunions over the last week. That's 28 miles of blood vessels. A pretty amazing thing. Getting up in the morning is a miracle. Making the morning coffee. Coffee is a miracle. The world's perfect drink, right? Getting up and having a cup of coffee in the morning. The ability to go out fishing is a miracle. Eating cinnamon rolls. I'm convinced that cinnamon rolls are a miracle, no doubt about it. Caring for each other and loving each other is a miracle. It's a miracle when people in your past suddenly show up, which I had happened to me today. Jill and Tim and Kelsey, where are you? They're way in the back, right back there. They were members at our church down in southern Minnesota, so if you want to get some dirt, talk to them. And Tim let me drive his combine once for about 3 hours, and I loved it. That was a miracle as well. I also received another amazing gift as well this morning. This morning I thought, I could go for a ding-dong. And here someone brought me ding-dongs this morning. An absolute miracle. Pay attention to those little miracles in your lives. God is at work everywhere you go. And paying attention to those big things can help us to see the small little miracles in life as well. And the last thing that I want to say is go out into the world this week and be a miracle to a neighbor. It was really cool in this gospel story how Jesus included the disciples in this miracle, the feeding of the 5,000 plus. They were the ones that went out and distributed the food. What a great example for us to go out into the world to be a miracle to our neighbor. A few weeks ago, the day that the power went out during our worship service, I distributed 5 $10 bills in an envelope, and the assignment was that individual who received that $10 bill had to go out and spend it in some way in the community to be a sort of little miracle. And a couple of people went to the YWCA and were able to buy diapers and other things with the $10. Another person bought a meal for someone at McDonald's, and he talked about what a great experience that was to buy a meal and he bought the meal for a woman and their child. And they were brought to tears by this amazing act, this amazing miracle that happened. And another person gave some money to the Children's Hospital here in Fargo. So go out and figure out a way to be a miracle. Maybe it's buying somebody's lunch, surprising them, smiling at someone, telling somebody that you're praying for them. Think about how you can be a miracle to somebody in your life or perhaps to a perfect stranger. The good news of this text is that God takes the impossible and makes it possible. This is very good news for us. Amen.